Good evening and welcome to PPS777B Week 4. Just finished, doing our teleconferences with everybody, and I really enjoyed those. I feel like we made a lot of progress. Definitely picking up on some of the insecurities and questions that you guys had at first, but by the time we finished our conversation, I feel like everybody had a clear view. So the goal is to just piece by piece narrow down from our research question to our population to our sample and to our instrument. How are we going to find the answers to our question? And so I've said it a lot already, and I'm going to say it a lot going forward. Trust the process is the theme of chapter 3. Whereas chapter 1 and 2, it's a little bit more straightforward. Chapter 3 is something you haven't had a lot of experience in, and you're talking with authority kind of like ahead of time before you've actually done it. But I could tell from our conversations that the more I've talked to you, the more you understand it, the more you can kind of conceptualize what your study is going to look like, which is great. So we've gone through, the research design. We've gone through the researcher's role and the research question. Now we're settling into our population and sample and instrumentation. So most of you at this point have an idea of exactly who you're going to talk to, or generally who you're going to talk to, how many of them there's going to be, what your process is for that. And most of you are either creating a questionnaire that I'm going to give you feedback on, or you have found a questionnaire or survey that pre-existed. And it's really important that we spend some time making sure that that is dialed in because of reliability and validity, which that will be the theme of our video next week. So for tonight, what we're going to focus on is simply the population and sample. Now that we've talked, population is a broadly what population are you looking at, and the sample is the people that you're inquiring with to get an idea of the answer that relates to the whole population. So we'll talk a little bit about that tonight. I'm seeing your IRB applications. They've come in. I'm going to look at those. They're really rough right now, and I'm going to give you feedback, and piece by piece we're going to get closer and closer to accomplishing that and finishing it. Most other classes are not turning that in until late October. For us, we're trying to do a little bit early of a timeline. I feel like we're all wrapping our minds around our study. And the reason that I'm doing that is then we'll have plenty of time to actually do our study. Once we're all set up, I'll work with you on informed consent forms, which we'll get into down the road. And we'll start scheduling those interviews and surveys, and you'll be ahead of the curve. That's the plan. So tonight, like I said, we're not going to have a lot in addition to, because you're kind of still figuring out the stuff I've already assigned. But tonight we're going to focus on population, sample, instrumentation, and I'll give you your assignments after that. I'm going to send out a schedule for us to have some phone conversations for the first part of next week. There will not be class again next week. However, like I promised, I will be sending out some dates in which I want to meet with those doing surveys and those doing interviews in the near future. And so we can talk about how to break down that data. But for now, this is what we have tonight, so let's get started. As you know, we've gone over the overview, the purpose, the research question, research design, and we kind of tipped the iceberg on population and sample last week. Remember, these are the new headers that we're working with. So tonight, we will dive a little further into population and sample, and then we'll talk about instrumentation. So here we go. The population is the overall target group. So what demographic that you're studying, what population. So for example, school psychologists in general would be your general population. And then that narrows down to school psychologists in Fresno Unified. Then that can narrow down to school psychologists in Fresno Unified who have worked on social emotional learning training of teachers. And from there, you'll talk about the sample, which is the specific group you're sampling that represents the greater population. So in this hypothetical instance, that would be 2 psychologists from Wawona Middle School two psychologists, from a high school, the director of special ed. So you're speaking specifically about the group that you are choosing for a sample that represents the trends of the whole population. And as we talked about in the past with our research, it's that upside down triangle where you're whittling down to that sample. In the sample section, you're going to describe how the sample was selected. So you'll talk about why you chose that sample and how they represent the whole. So a lot of you already started this, so I want you to write those two sections with the new mindset, the new context that I've given you after we've talked specifically. So try your best to be as specific as possible. Start with that general population and then narrow it down to the sample that you'll be using for your particular study. So for instrumentation, this is where you're going to describe your tool, and this is where you're going to include it in the index eventually. So you're going to talk about how the interview and survey was designed in accordance with your research question. You're going to write this is from last week. You're going to write the whole thing at this point. So you're going to write 4 to 6 paragraphs. So this is the slide that I took from last week. Using that same context, let's break it down a little further. I want you to write this whole entire section this week as a rough draft. The first 2 to 3 paragraphs of instrumentation is going to be based on the research question, how did you choose your instrument? And why did the researcher choose an interview, or why did the researcher choose a survey? As well as how were the questions developed and how do they address the research question? So that's going to be your first 2 paragraphs, is kind of specifically talking about how it relates to the research question, why did you choose it, why does that best fit it, and then go into how the questions were developed and what were they based off of. The next 2 to 3 paragraphs was what was the process for you selecting who you selected in the study. How are the participants invited and informed? So you're going to talk about your informed consent form. I know you haven't created it yet, but you're going to touch on that. How are these questions developed, and what commonly known framework or criteria did you use? So if you're using MTSS or PBIS or social emotional learning, what already existing research-based framework or kind of like philosophy have you based those questions on? That's why when you're developing the questions, say for an interview, if it's 8 to 10 questions, you really need to tie those questions to the specific program or process that you're investigating. The reason why you're going to do that is it adds to reliability and validity of your study, because instead of just coming up with these questions out of thin air, you're basing it on something that researchers and the scholars have already looked at. So lastly, you're going to talk about if it is an interview, you're going to go into the fact that you are really the instrumentation, part of the instrumentation, because you're investigating it. So you're having these discussions. So you are using a tool and a questionnaire, but you are part of the instrumentation as the interviewer. If it's a survey, the survey itself is the only instrumentation. So you'll go into that. And you're going to describe what were the obstacles for the researcher to have to overcome to ensure instrumentation was accurate and provide strong data. So you'll spell that out. So this is an example from my dissertation. You can kind of look at it. I can email this out to you. You don't have to read through the whole dissertation, but in my instrumentation, you can see here that I basically followed the same questions that I laid out for you here previously. So I really go into, why I chose the interview, how it's related to the research question. For me, I did an interview that was 10 questions, and I based those 10 questions on the basic categories for transformational leadership. So each of my questions was on the topic of, one of the categories of transformational leadership. So that's just an example. So the last thing I need you to do is you originally wrote the researcher's role. So you're going to have to move that paragraph. Right now, it's currently sitting in research design, I believe, in your papers. I need you to move that down to a new header that says characteristics of the researcher. So if you wrote out researcher's role, that's the new heading that you're going to put it under. The good news at this point, you're basically, in terms of a rough draft, you've completed, half of the headers. Next week, we're going to focus a lot more on the next 2 to 3 headers, which is validity and reliability. And I'll give you some context and talk about some specifics in those areas, and just preparing us for IRB. So this week, what we're working on is keep working on those IRB applications after I send out edits. Keep working on the survey and questionnaire after I send edits. Make sure I have that. And number 3, finish population setting and instrumentation for your rough draft. So get these 3 back to me, before the next class. And remember, the weekends are my grading nights. Okay, that's it for tonight. It's a lot shorter video tonight. I want you to keep working on those things I've already assigned you. So just consider this more of a work week, and be looking for that schedule. We're going to talk early next week and get a little bit more specific and take the next step towards completing Chapter 3. Great job, everybody. I look forward to talking to you. Have a good night.